the characteristics of life and nutrient cycles. So first of all, what is the environment? Well, you already know this. This is the space that holds everything around you. Within that environment, you're going to have biotic factors, which are all the living things. Bio itself actually means life. And then you have the abiotic factors, which means the non-living objects or any conditions that go along with that. A in front of a word always means not, so not living. Living, not living. Things like air, so the composition of the air, how much oxygen there is available, how much CO2, all that kind of stuff. The rocks that are available, what type of soil you have, what type of water you have. These are all abiotic factors. They influence what type of plants can grow, and then the type of plants that grow, which are biotic factors, also influence what type of animals can live there. It could also be, for abiotic factors, could also be a condition like temperature, the amount of light that's available, or even the wind can have an effect. Now, ecology itself is a study of the interactions between all the biotic components and all the abiotic factors in an environment. But how do you decide whether something is biotic or living, or whether something is abiotic? Well, the simple acronym to remember is Mrs. Grenham, and it'll do you well to memorize this now in grade 9, because you'll see it every year as you study science in high school. All living things have these basic 8 characteristics. They can all move, they can all respire, they're all sensitive to the environment, they can grow, they can reproduce and make new organisms, they have nutrition requirements because they need energy to do all those things above, and that means that they also will excrete waste, and they make stuff, they manufacture products. So movement then is the internal ability to change your place or change your position. This means that you are making the decision. It's not like the wind blowing a dead leaf. This is the leaf itself being able to move. Now, you may think, well, how do plants move? Aren't plants stuck with their roots in the ground? Well, yes, but they are able to open and close flowers. They're able to turn their branches so that their leaves point towards the sun. There's a lot that plants can actually do. So plants do move. Obviously, animals move as well. Then there's respiration. Now, respiration, sometimes we say breathing, but what we really mean is exchanging gases for the purpose of making energy for the cells. So, for example, you can take oxygen gas from the environment. You use your blood system to distribute it to the cells. Then they take that oxygen and they're going to make energy through a process called cellular respiration. Then you produce carbon dioxide gas and you release that as a waste product. So it's oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. That's respiration. Not all organisms use oxygen. Some of them actually can't use oxygen. Oxygen would kill them. And so not all organisms will produce carbon dioxide. But many, many, many do. So we'll focus on the majority of the organisms. Sensitivity to the environment is the internal ability. Again, this is the organism itself being able to respond to changes in the external, which is outside the organism, or the internal environment, which is inside the organism. If it's external, it could be something like there's a window in your house and the house plant turns its leaves towards the window so that it can get the maximum amount of light. That is responding to changes in the amount of light in the environment. If it's an internal environment, it could be that maybe the plant senses that it's running out of water. Maybe the soil is getting dry, and so it may close up its leaves so that the leaves don't leak out so much water, so it doesn't dehydrate so quickly. So that's a response to external and a response to internal environment. Living things grow. That means the ability to either increase in size, so increase in the number of cells, or it could also be talking about developing towards maturity. By the time you become a teenager, you probably have reached your maximum height, but your cells are still developing. You're still going to go through maturity until you become an adult. With reproduction, what we mean is not just individual cells, but actually the ability to make a brand new organism. All living things come from other living things. Anytime you want to get a new cell, you have to have it come from an old cell. Then, of course, I already mentioned this. You're going to have nutrition needs because these things up above here are going to take energy. So you're going to take in and use nutrients from the environment to help you produce that energy, or to use that nutrition as building blocks because you have to build or manufacture products. Living cells are going to make stuff. Anything that you take in that you don't end up using or that you end up recycling will be excreted, and you'll get rid of those as waste products. So please memorize Mrs. Grenham, MRSGRENM. It will serve you well in your high school science career. We have a very, very, very organized nature. And the levels of organization are studied by different scientific disciplines. Chemistry really focuses on atoms and molecules and the interactions between molecules. Then you get a little bit larger. So atoms make molecules, molecules make cells, and biology really focuses on the cells, how the cells fit together to make tissues, how tissues work together to become organs, organs work together to make organ systems, and organ systems make organisms. This is the realm of biology. But when you go larger and you say, well, how do organisms interact with one another? That's within populations, and then communities, ecosystems, and then finally biospheres. And this is what ecology studies. It's these large level interactions between organisms and the environment that the organisms live in. It's also about how energy flows from one organism to another. So we're going to talk about predation and symbiosis and mutualism, and also how the nutrients are recycled within the environment. So these would be how the living organisms are going to use resources and then leave behind a waste product that another organism is then able to use for their food or for their metabolic processes to make energy. Okay, so let's dive now into the nutrient cycles themselves. First, we're going to chat about the water cycle. This is one that you are very familiar with. We've talked about this all the way through elementary school, and we even mentioned it at the beginning of grade 9 chemistry. And here you have a reminder of these terms. Evaporation, that's when you go from liquid water to gas water. Then you've got condensation. That's when you go the opposite direction. You go from a gaseous water or a vapor into the liquid. And then precipitation is when that falls. There are different types of precipitation. You can have rain, snow, sleet, ice pellets, and even hail. These are all considered precipitation. Precipitation just means when the water suddenly forms in that liquid form, it comes out of the gas that we couldn't see, and suddenly we can see it. And now because it's so heavy and dense, more dense than the air around it, it begins to fall. When it falls and it hits the land, some of it is going to not be able to be absorbed by that land. And if it can't be absorbed, we call it runoff. This is where you get your streams and your rivers. That's the water flowing, simply because the ground already has too much water and it can't soak it up. Or there's just not enough time to soak it up. When the land does soak it up, that's called seepage, and that'll take the water from the land itself and it'll go into the ground, and it'll form something called groundwater, or it'll form something called an aquifer, which is basically an underground lake. California right now is having a lot of problems with sinkholes because they've gone through a period of a great drought in the last while, and their aquifers are being emptied of water because the people are overusing it, which is leaving these massive caverns underground. And when there's all that pressure of the buildings and the traffic and whatnot up above, when these aquifers get emptied, the ground collapses and that forms sinkholes. So it's important that you're not overusing your water, that the aquifers have enough time to fill up so that this water pressure can push up and support the ground above it. Now, most of the water cycle is abiotic. It's what we just said there, where you have the evaporation and the condensation and precipitation. But living organisms also have a role. Specifically, plants have a very important role in the water cycle. Here's what they do. They take up water through their roots. They use the water for photosynthesis, and any extra water that they have little holes in the underside of their leaves. This is where they breathe. This is where they exchange gases, is in their leaves, basically like their lungs. And then there's something called transpiration. Transpiration is a fancy way of saying that the plants begin to lose water. So water lost from the tissues of the plants. And when that happens, it evaporates into the air, and then that can also go up into the atmosphere and condense and form precipitation. Next, we have the carbon cycle. Now, the carbon cycle, quite simply, is how we recycle carbon from being carbon dioxide. It gets used through photosynthesis to make sugars. Things like phytoplankton or even other larger plants are able to go through photosynthesis, and then they can make the sugar. Then you have consumers that are going to eat that sugar, and then the consumers themselves, once they've taken that carbon and put it into their bodies, then they would die. When they die, they can be decomposed, and the decomposers are able to convert the carbon from the consumers and turn it back into carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide through photosynthesis comes into plants. Animals eat the plants, animals die, decomposers eat the dead animals, and then the CO2 is returned to the atmosphere. That's one of the pathways. Another pathway, which is more common since the Industrial Revolution, is that you could have these dead organisms be compressed with under a lot of heat and a lot of pressure, give it some time, and you can actually turn those dead organisms in the right conditions into fossil fuels. And we've discovered that fossil fuels, which is your oil and gas, are really great at being a good energy store for our motors, etc., heating our homes and all sorts of things. We couldn't do without fossil fuels right now. And when we burn those fossil fuels, that releases the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere as well. So it's trapped right now under the ground, and we are releasing it back into the atmosphere. When the decomposers are actually taking apart the dead organisms, they can either convert the carbon that they find to some kind of carbon molecule that's useful for producers and consumers, or they can convert it directly back to CO2 gas. So it depends. Different types of decomposers. So for example, think about the type of fungus that is eating a dead tree in the forest. The next tree that or seed that falls near that rotting log is able to use the carbon compounds that the decomposers have just created, or other types of decomposers can go even farther and take those carbon compounds and release the carbon dioxide when they go through cellular respiration. So you have carbon dioxide through photosynthesis by plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. They produce sugar. The sugar is eaten by all living organisms, including the plants themselves. Plants also eat the sugar that they produce. And then through cellular respiration, it's converted back into carbon dioxide. And again, you can have other pathways as well, because the glucose or that sugar gets built into the different organisms as they're growing. And when those organisms die, the decomposers, like the bacteria and the fungus, are able to recycle that carbon back into carbon dioxide gas. Or the dead and dying organisms, they can form fossil fuels, and then we burn the fossil fuels to return the carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So all of this contributes to the carbon cycle. Finally, we have the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle starts with nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. Then what's going to happen is it's going to be taken up not by plants themselves. Plants cannot directly use the nitrogen gas. It's actually taken up by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. To fix something in this sense, in the chemical sense, is to take the nitrogen and attach it to another molecule. So there are little nodules, which are little lumpy, bumpy bits in the roots of certain types of plants called legumes. And living inside those nodules are the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So it's not the plants themselves that can do it, it's the bacteria. And the bacteria are able to take that nitrogen gas, and they're able to, through a process called ammonification, they're able to produce a compound called ammonia. Ammonia can also be produced when decomposers are doing their job. So you can either get it from nitrogen-fixing bacteria, or you can get it from the decomposition of dead bodies. After you have the ammonia, then you're going to go through a process called nitrification. And this is done by nitrifying bacteria. The nitrification, after I get that, is going to produce something called a nitrite or a nitrate. There's two different sets of bacteria that are able to do this. So you need the nitrifying bacteria that can make the nitrites first, and then you need a second type of bacteria that can make the nitrates. Once you have nitrates available, then you can the plants can take that up as a fertilizer and it becomes part of their body, and then the consumers eat that, and then the consumers of course die, the decomposers can return it. Or there are other types of bacteria, and they are able to take those nitrates and convert them back into nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. Let's take a look and see what's written down here. So you've got, again, nitrogen gas. becomes ammonia, becomes nitrates or nitrites, and then it gets converted back to nitrogen gas. And that's your nitrogen cycle. So again, the important terms are ammonification, nitrification. Okay, ammonification to make ammonia, nitrification makes nitrates. All right. So here again, nitrogen in the air, you have ammonification by nitrogen fixing bacteria. It makes your ammonia. Then you nitrify it by nitrifying bacteria. You make your nitrites or nitrates, which can be used as fertilizer in plants and enters the food chain that way. Or you can have denitrification by denitrifying bacteria, and that's converting this back into the nitrogen. And that is the end of this lesson. Please complete this task on page 5. You're going to need the textbook to be able to do these questions.